Beneath the forgotten ridges of the Ozark Hills, stories survive that were never meant to be told. They linger like whispers in abandoned cabins, carved into the bones of families who lived and died in silence. And among these stories is one that stands apart. A story so corrosive, so bound in shame, that even the people who carried it tried to erase themselves from memory. He was a man who fathered 3 sons with his own sister, a patriarch born in secrecy who built his house not from wood and stone, but from blood bound too closely together. In the shadow of the Ozarks, where poverty clung to the soil and superstition poisoned the air, this man's choices tore through generations. To outsiders, he was just another weathered face among mountain folk, but to those who lived within his reach, he was the author of a legacy no one dared to write down. Until now. The Ozarks were already a land apart, a place where families lived miles from their nearest neighbor, where the church bell carried further than the law, and where blood ties often doubled as chains. Survival was fragile, depending on what you could grow, what you could hunt, and who you could trust. Yet, when the walls of isolation closed in, trust often turned inward. Families married families, cousins became couples, and in the most secret corners, the line between sister and wife, brother and husband, blurred until it vanished. The man at the heart of this story was not the first to cross that line, but he became the most infamous, even if only in whispers. His family became a living monument to what happens when desperation, isolation, and desire all collapse into one. The hills kept their secrets well, wrapping them in silence and distance, but the children told another story. They bore the marks of a legacy no one wanted to name, twisted features, stunted growth, and eyes that never seemed to look quit. Straight. They were both sons and nephews, both heirs and reminders of the sin that brought them into the world, and in a community that judged harshly but spoke rarely, their very existence was both proof and punishment. The patriarch himself, though, seemed untouched by shame. He sat in his cabin as if daring the world to confront him, as if the hills themselves had given him permission. This is not just the story of one man. It is the story of what silence breeds, of what isolation demands, and of how blood, when turned inward, can become its own curse. The man's name has faded, half erased by time and the reluctance of locals to keep it alive, but the outlines of his life remain, sketched in testimony, rumor, and the haunted faces of his descendants. He was born into poverty, as most in the Ozarks were. The land gave little, the soil thin, the work endless. Families leaned on each other because they had no choice. Brothers worked side by side in the fields, sisters stitched clothes by candlelight, and when winter closed in, survival meant drawing close, closer than anyone should have. His sister was barely a woman when he began to claim her as something more than blood. No marriage certificate marked their union. No preacher spoke words over it. It was a pact written in shadows, sealed behind closed doors, and known only to the children who came from it. Each child was a betrayal, but also a proclamation. The patriarch seemed almost defiant in what he had done, as if he wanted the world to look and see. And yet the hills swallowed up judgment. Neighbors whispered, yes, but they did not intervene. In places where lawmen rarely set foot, where sheriffs were days away and ministers feared crossing their congregations, what could be done? Families in the hills had long learned one truth: some things you turned your eyes from, because to face them was to face the same blood in your own line. The sister he claimed as his own wife lived a life of erasure. She bore him sons and carried his shame, yet her name is almost never remembered. In the few traces left behind, she appears only as his sister, as though her existence could be collapsed into his act. Was she a victim, too afraid to resist in a world where women had little power? Or was she a partner, complicit in keeping the walls of silence intact? We will never truly know. All we know is that she carried his children into the world, and each one was both a content and a sentence. The three boys grew up knowing they were bound to their father in ways that had no name. They called him both father and uncle. Their mother was both sister and wife. Their very identities were built on contradictions, and the shame of it seeped into them like damp into wood. They bore the weight of choices made before they could speak, choices that shaped their bodies, their names, and their futures. The sons themselves became walking evidence of their father's defiance against natural order. Neighbors remembered them not for their words, but for their faces. One boy's jaw never quite formed right, his teeth crowding forward in a permanent grimace. Another had eyes that drifted apart as if they could not agree on what to look at. The youngest, though sturdier, carried a strange quietness, a withdrawn stillness as though the world pressed too heavily on him. In a community where difference was a brand, the boys never escaped the mark of their parentage. They walked through the hills like living confessions, each feature telling the story their father would not. Children in the Ozark Hollows can be cruel, but cruelty often comes not in words, but in distance. These boys were not beaten down by peers so much as left to stand alone. No one invited them to play, no girl's family would dare look their way, and when they passed on the road, others would glance aside, as if shame itself could be caught like a sickness. Their father sat unmoved in his cabin, watching the world turn against his sons, never softening, never apologizing. To him, they were his legacy, proof that he had taken what he wanted and dared anyone to speak against him. But the silence surrounding the family was more than shame. It was fear. Fear of what it meant to admit that such things could happen in your own community. Fear of recognizing that the line between survival and sin was sometimes as thin as the walls of a one-room cabin. The patriarch embodied that fear, turning it into a weapon. His presence alone reminded others that the hills protected their own, even when their own broke every law of blood and body. And yet, in the children's eyes, a different story was written, one of suffering that no silence could erase. Each glance, each crooked smile, each shadowed movement whispered of the price exacted when boundaries are broken. They became the true record, the only testimony of what had been done, and in the way neighbors avoided them, in the way whispers grew when they passed, the community confessed what it would not say aloud. They knew, they all knew. As the boys grew into men, the weight of their lineage became heavier than the stones that lined the Ozark creeks. Their father's shadow followed them everywhere, not as a name of respect, but as a curse spoken in hushed tones. Work was hard to come by when everyone knew the story of your birth. Even the poorest farmers, desperate for hands to split wood or plow fields, hesitated before letting the sons of a brother and sister step foot on their land. It was as though misfortune clung to them, and no one wanted it to spread. The hills offered little escape. There were no bustling towns just over the ridge, no chance of anonymity in a place where every face was known. So they remained, tethered to the same soil that had bred them. Some accounts say the eldest tried to carve a life apart, seeking companionship from outside the hollow, but whispers drove his would-be bride's family away. Others say the youngest slipped deeper into himself, avoiding the eyes of anyone who looked too long. Whatever they tried, the stain remained. Blood remembers, the community remembers, and even if the church took them in on Sundays, no sermon could wash away the fact of who they were. Their father, by then greying and weathered, sat with a kind of grim pride. To him, their suffering was not a consequence, but a crown. He had bent the order of things and survived long enough to see his defiance passed into flesh. He had taken what was forbidden and made it permanent, carving it into his sons' faces for all to see. If shame weighed on him, it was buried too deep for anyone to find. But time erodes even the strongest walls of silence. With each passing year, the story spread further, carried not by the family, but by those who looked on in disgust. Strangers traveling through the hills began to hear the whispers. Children who had once mocked in silence grew into adults who told the tale, in darker tones, half warning, half curse. The family's name became a shadowy warning in the Ozarks. This is what happens when blood is turned against itself. By the time the patriarch was an old man, he had become less of a figure and more of a symbol, a reminder of how far the human will can twist when left unchecked, and how deep the scars can run when a community chooses silence over confrontation. When death finally came for him, it did not come as punishment. There was no mob, no trial, no judgment from the law. He died in the same hills where he had lived, in the same cabin where shadows had clung to the walls for decades. Some say he went quietly in his sleep, his breath slipping away like the smoke of his hearth fire. Others claim his end was harsher, that his body withered in pain as if his blood itself had turned against him. Whatever the truth, the man who had fathered sons with his sister left this world without answering to anyone but the silence he had cultivated. The community, too, responded in silence. There was no mourning procession, no neighbors gathering to honor his name. His burial was said to be simple, hurried, a hole in the earth, a mound of dirt, and no marker to speak of who lay beneath. The hills absorbed him as they had absorbed his deeds, leaving only whispers behind. And yet, the ground above him never quite seemed to rest. The children he left behind, already men by then, carried the story onward, whether they wished to or not. Their faces were his gravestone, their lives, his legacy. And what of the sister who bore his sons? Her fate is even more obscured, lost in the fog of memory. Did she die before him, carried to her grave under the weight of secrecy and shame, or did she live on, watching her sons grow into the very reminders of the life forced upon her? Her name is gone, erased by a culture that chose not to remember women unless they served as caution or virtue. She became a ghost in her own story, known only as his sister, as though she had no identity outside of the sin bound to her. Even after death, the patriarch's presence lingered. People avoided the place where he had lived, some out of disgust, others out of superstition. Children were told not to wander near the old cabin. Travelers were warned that the land was cursed, and in truth, perhaps it was. For the curse was not a haunting in the supernatural sense. It was a curse of memory, of shame, of faces that could not lie. The bloodline was the haunting. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? As the decades rolled on, his name dissolved into rumor, but his story did not die. The Ozarks have long memories, and even when the details blur, the shape of a tale remains. Travelers would hear fragments told around campfires, about a man who lived deep in the hills, who claimed his own sister as a wife, and whose sons carried the burden of his defiance. Some retellings painted him as a monster, others as a symbol of the lawlessness of mountain life. In every version, however, the horror was the same, the breaking of the most sacred bond, and the generations scarred by it. The sons tried to scatter into obscurity, but the land is not kind to those marked by shame. Some records suggest one left the Ozarks, slipping away to the flatlands in search of anonymity. But even far from the hills, whispers followed. In towns where surnames carried weight, where strangers were quickly noticed, his past clung to him like a shadow. Others remained behind, tending small plots of land, living half-lives that ended quietly. None of them rose to prominence, none escaped into prosperity. Their futures had been written before they were born, etched into them by the choices of their father. For those who stayed in the region, the family name became a warning, never spoken aloud to outsiders, but passed in murmurs from one generation to the next. Mothers told their children, "Don't wander too far into the hollows, don't get too close to certain kin, remember what happened when blood was turned inward." The patriarch had become a myth, not because he was larger than life, but because his story embodied the darkest possibilities of isolation. He was remembered precisely because people wished to forget. And still, the hills kept their silence. No official record, no written account, no court testimony survives to prove the story. It lives instead in oral memory, in the way faces change. When the tale is brought up, in the way voices lower when his name, if it is spoken at all, is uttered. It is a story half believed, half denied, yet always alive. For in every community there are truths too terrible to write down, but too heavy to vanish completely. The patriarch of the Ozark Hills remains one of them. And so we return to the beginning, to a cabin in the hills, to a man whose choices rewrote the lives of everyone bound to him. His was not the story of love, nor even of lust, but of power, of control, and of silence that stretched across generations. He had 3 sons with his own sister. That fact alone is enough to chill the blood, but the true horror lies not only in the act, but in the way it was allowed to persist. No sheriff rode in to stop him. No preacher broke down his door. His neighbors looked, they whispered, but they did nothing. In their silence, they became part of the story too. This is what makes his tale endure. It is not just about one man's corruption, but about the fragility of the boundaries we believe protect us. When isolation deepens, when poverty gnaws at the bone, when shame is stronger than justice, lines blur. Brother becomes husband, sister becomes mother. Children become both and neither. And what is left is not just a broken family, but a broken community that chose silence over truth. In the end, the patriarch's cabin rotted back into the earth. The boards collapsed, the roof caved in, vines swallowed what was once a home. But the memory did not rot with it. It lingers in the hills, in the stories told under breath, in the caution passed from elder to child. A reminder that even in the quietest corners of America, horrors grow in the soil alongside corn and beans. When you hear the phrase, the most inbred patriarch of the Ozark Hills, it is easy to imagine a monster, and perhaps he was. But perhaps the more unsettling truth is that he was human, a man who lived, who ate, who worked, who smiled, and who chose to bind his blood to itself until it screamed through generations. That is the real terror. Not that he was inhuman, but that he was one of us. You were never meant to know this story. It was meant to die in the hills with him. And yet, here you are, listening, remembering, carrying it forward. And in doing so, you ensure that his silence has finally been broken.